Imagine a world exactly like ours. Globalized, wealthy, connected. For 2,000 years, a handful of superpowers had dominated the known world. They weren't just thriving, they were the masters of the world. The massive Hittite Empire, the Kingdom of Mitanni in modern-day Iraq, the rich culture of Cyprus, the city-state of Ugarit, the Mycenaean civilization, Assyria, Babylon, and the mighty Egyptian Empire. These titans stood unrivaled. They had intricate diplomacy and trade routes that spanned continents. It was the first true global economy in human history. A golden age that seemed too big to fail. But around 1200 BC, the lights went out, violently. One by one, these civilizations collapsed. Cities were burned to ash. Writing vanished. And a wave of total destruction swept across the Mediterranean. The Near East, Europe, North Africa, all plunged into a brutal dark age that would last for centuries. Historians have debated the cause of this apocalypse for generations. Why did the system break? But there is one terrifying factor that everyone agrees on. A mysterious wave of invasions from the sea. Hordes of raiders that wiped out entire cities in a relentless campaign of annihilation. They left no kingdom. They left no history. We know them only by the name the terrified Egyptians gave them. The Sea Peoples. Who were they? A ghost army that came out of nowhere. They were the executioners of the ancient world. But how did they erase 2,000 years of civilization in a single lifetime? This is the story of the first apocalypse and the hunt for some of the most ruthless killers in history. The Sea Peoples. Around 1180 BC, the world witnessed an unprecedented wave of chaos and destruction. Deep within the walls of the great palace of Ramses III, Pharaoh of Egypt, disturbing news from distant lands weighed on his shoulders. Reports of mysterious invaders, known only as the Sea Peoples, were sweeping across the ancient world, leaving devastation in their wake. And then, in 1177 BC, in the waters near the Egyptian coast, a formidable fleet of warships with black sails was sighted. Their arrival on the banks of the Nile River would mark the decline of the Egyptian Empire, bringing its former glory to an end. By the end of the Late Bronze Age, Egypt was only a shadow of what it once was, and never again rose to the heights of a mighty empire. By the 13th century BC, Egypt was experiencing one of the most glorious moments in its history. During the New Kingdom, under the Nile's immense influence, culture, politics, and the economy flourished, marking a momentous period of growth. It was experiencing a renaissance of the arts and literature. The power of the pharaohs was embodied in architectural masterpieces such as the majestic temples of Karnak and Luxor. The rulers of this era, such as Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, oversaw a significant revival in sculpture and hieroglyphic writing. Politically, the New Kingdom marked a period of expansion and consolidation of Egyptian power. The pharaohs extended their rule into Nubia and the Levant, establishing a vast empire stretching from the Nile River to the Euphrates. This military and political rise enabled Egypt to assert its influence in the region and control crucial trade routes. And Egypt was not isolated. It was a significant part of an extensive interconnected trading network that reached from the southern coasts of Britain all the way to the mountains of Afghanistan, and even further east. This system was the richest and most stable economy that had ever existed. At Amarna, the capital of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, it was discovered that the mighty rulers of that era maintained regular communication to secure marriage alliances, commercial agreements, and even joint military campaigns. More than 300 cuneiform letters, written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the time, were sent back and forth across the ancient world for hundreds of years, and they were discovered only at this site. But by the end of the 13th century BC, everything began to change in the world. After centuries of stability, disturbing reports started to come in, causing unease. A series of natural disasters were weakening the agricultural and economic infrastructure of the civilizations of the time. In Hattusa, the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire, famine struck year after year. In mainland Greece, the grand palace complexes of the Mycenaean warrior kings were burned to the ground. Decline had also come to Egypt. Despite the efforts of Pharaoh Ramses III, his state was part of a world system that was no longer self-sufficient. After several years, Egypt started receiving reports of the invasion of the eastern Mediterranean region by large groups of looters. The chaos and disruption caused by this invasion were enormous. A coalition of nomadic peoples and migratory groups was attacking and plundering various coastal regions from Anatolia to the Levant, causing significant disruption to the civilizations of the time. The inscriptions and records from that time bear witness to the local rulers' desperate efforts to protect themselves from the mysterious invaders. These enigmatic forces arrived in warships and caused immense destruction in their path. And around 1177 BC, they would arrive in Egypt. But before delving into the consequences these invasions had for the Egyptian Empire, let's go back to the dawn of the Sea People's mysterious invasions, when a veil of uncertainty fell over the ancient coastal civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the future grew shrouded in doubt. In 1928, a farmer was plowing his land near the present-day coastal town of Ras Shamra in Syria, unaware that he was about to set in motion a significant chapter in the history of archaeology, one that would provide a crucial clue in investigating the collapse of the Bronze Age. While working the land, his shovel struck something that didn't seem ordinary: a hidden entrance beneath the surface. This chance discovery would become an archaeological landmark. As he carefully excavated, he discovered the entrance to an ancient tomb. News of the farmer's discovery spread quickly and reached the local authorities. Since Syria was under French rule at the time, officials called in experts from the Louvre Museum in Paris to investigate the discovery further. Archaeologist Claude Schaefer was assigned to this investigation. Schaefer, who had already written extensively on Bronze Age burial mounds, was the obvious person for the job. Under Schaefer's supervision, the team began excavating the tomb. Within days, it became clear that they had discovered not just a solitary burial site, but an entire ancient cemetery, dating back to the late Bronze Age. The discovery of this cemetery made Schaefer think it highly probable that a significant ancient city was also nearby. When Schaefer's team began excavating a mound a few hundred meters to the east, toward the coast, the ruins of a large city and a port were slowly revealed. Schaefer's unanswered question was why this port had been abandoned. It had excellent coastal access to Asia Minor and Egypt, making it a crucial gateway for more distant powers. The key question was, what happened at this location? Could its proximity to the sea have been a factor? It was believed that attacks from the sea were frequent at that time. Could this have been the work of the Sea Peoples? One of the most significant discoveries was a large collection of clay tablets, inscribed with cuneiform. But these tablets were not written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the late Bronze Age and the language spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. It was a completely different language, one they had never seen before. What was the ancient port city that Schaefer had discovered? What was this indecipherable language? The tablets could be the key to understanding what this site was. In Paris, some of France's top experts in ancient languages examined the cuneiform tablets, and in doing so, discovered something surprising. This new language was not syllabic. It was alphabetic, a style of writing far more sophisticated than any form of cuneiform writing they had seen before. The tablets unearthed by Schaefer are believed to contain one of the oldest known alphabetic writing systems in the world, and were, at the time, poised to reveal its secrets. Amazingly, Claude Schaefer had discovered an immense site of great significance. That ancient city was Ugarit, a city that was pivotal in the history of Near Eastern civilizations. However, Schaefer faced an enigma. He did not know the identity of this civilization and the reasons behind its disappearance. The city of Ugarit, a prosperous coastal trading hub located in northern Syria, held sway over a maritime kingdom for over 600 years. Located at the end of the Silk Road, this bustling city served as a meeting point on vast trade routes that stretched from distant places such as China and the Mediterranean. It was a major maritime and trade center, able to maintain close and profitable relations with the major powers of the day. The city of Ugarit reached its zenith during the late Bronze Age, particularly between the 18th and 15th centuries BC. At this time, the kingdom had a population of about 25,000 inhabitants. However, this prosperous city was about to meet its end. Its opulence was evident in the abundance of luxury objects unearthed by Claude Schaefer. But it became clear that these luxury objects were buried in the ground, as if they had been intentionally left behind. Why would the inhabitants of Ugarit discard such beautiful and clearly valuable objects? Archaeologists began to uncover evidence that might provide an answer to these questions. Among the destroyed buildings, they found a distinctive layer of ash. A layer of destruction, up to 2 meters thick in some places, made of ash and broken bricks. The city's roofs had collapsed and shattered, and its streets were littered with arrowheads. Ugarit was ravaged by large-scale fires. Walls were torn down. There was an imminent threat, and the inhabitants of Ugarit had to quickly abandon the city. They were forced to flee the destruction. They took what they could and fled. This prosperous cosmopolitan and thriving metropolis of the late Bronze Age, was destroyed and abandoned overnight. Where did the inhabitants of Ugarit go after fleeing the city? We do not have an answer to this. This is one of the many mysteries that surround this period. It seems the people of Ugarit disappeared at this point in history. But what could have caused this sudden flight? The decline was so sudden that archaeologists still found tablets in the city's kilns, prepared for firing. Archaeologists examined the cuneiform tablets for clues. These tablets contain the last written messages from this land, messages that would never be delivered. The tablets indicated that the destruction of Ugarit occurred between 1190 and 1185 BC. But archaeologists also realized that the disappearance of Ugarit at that point was not unique. Between 1200 and 1150 BC, the great Hittite, Egyptian, and Mycenaean civilizations also began to crumble. All this marked the end of the Bronze Age. What or who could have caused such a level of destruction that an entire period of human history came to an end? Examining the tablets, archaeologists made a surprising discovery. A letter from King Amurapi of Ugarit to the king of nearby Alashia in present-day Cyprus. On this clay tablet, Amurapi's letter showed his desperation. In the letter, he implored the ruler of nearby Cyprus to come to his aid.
Father, the enemy's ships have arrived. They have been burning my cities and have done evil in my land. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are stationed at Hattusa? And all my ships are in the land of Luca. They have not yet returned, so the land is abandoned.
The help never arrived because the letter was never sent. It is hard to say how great a force attacked them, but another letter found in the furnaces of the city asks another king to equip 150 ships to send to their aid, which suggests the attackers were a very large force. This letter was also never sent. The fact that all of Ugarit's troops and ships were stationed elsewhere when they were attacked shows how much they were taken by surprise. Who were the seaborne raiders who destroyed Ugarit? And were they related to the Bronze Age collapse? Archaeologists turned to other civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. Perhaps there was evidence of similar attacks on other empires. In the desolate, mountainous heart of modern Turkey lay Anatolia. It was home to what was once the capital of the Hittite Empire, Hattusa. 3,000 years ago, Hattusa stood here, the capital of a forgotten empire, one of the most powerful and influential of its time. The ancient and powerful Hittite Empire, which had been a major player in the ancient world, gradually faded into obscurity, leaving only archaeological remains to tell their story. Almost nothing more was known about them until the 19th century, when explorers traveling through the vast expanse of central Turkey found a lost city. What they discovered astonished the archaeological world. In 1833, French archaeologist Charles Félix Marie Texier was sent on an exploratory mission to Asia Minor. In 1834, near the present-day small town of Bogaskoy, Texier discovered the ruins of a large ancient city. But it was not until the beginning of the 1900s that clay tablets began to be found, with cuneiform inscriptions. Thousands of tablets were recovered, most of them in an unknown language. The few Akkadian texts firmly identified the site as the city of Hattusa. But upon excavating the ruins of Hattusa, a thin black layer was found just above the ancient floors of the city. This layer was composed of ash, charred wood, and debris burned in a fierce fire. Taken together, the evidence was breathtaking. Walls and ceilings collapsed. Bricks were broken and melted. And it is clear that what happened in Hattusa was savage, relentless, and total. And this destruction dates to the end of the 13th century BC, around 1220 BC. The archaeological record ends there. The ruins of Hattusa remained empty for centuries. In cities surrounding Hattusa, such as Alakajoyuk, the same pattern is found. A city completely covered in ash and rubble at the same level. In Chadur Hoyuk, another fortified Hittite city, arrowheads lie scattered, and the bones of men, women, and children left in the streets where they fell. Hattusa was home to a dynasty of warrior kings. The city was surrounded by an impressive double wall built of gray limestone. More than 100 towers defended these walls, making it an impenetrable fortress. This strategic location gave it both defensive and commercial advantages. The people of Hattusa grew wheat, barley, and lentils, and wore clothes made from the wool of the sheep they tended in the nearby hills. For more than 3,000 years, all we had on the Hittites was a couple of references in the Bible. That was it. 4,000 years ago, the Hittites emerged as a powerful tribe. They controlled the remote highlands of Anatolia. Over the next 5 centuries, their powerful warrior kings expanded their borders into the ancient lands of the Bible, overthrowing empires in the process. By the 14th century BC, by the time of Hattusili, the Hittites had only one comparable rival: ancient Egypt, ruled by Pharaoh Ramses II. The clash of these two empires determined the course of history. The main confrontation between the two powers would take place at the Battle of Kadesh. However, as Egypt became the most famous civilization of the ancient world, the Hittites completely disappeared from the records. But why did this happen? After Kadesh, Hattusili's son, the Hittite king Tudhaliya IV, emerged as the last strong ruler. His challenges were not limited to the west and south. The east also presented formidable adversaries. Located north of Babylonia, Assyria, a kingdom among the most powerful in the world, was on the warpath. although the Hittites still maintained their status as a world power and managed to defend their core territories against the Assyrians. The 13th century was marked by the loss of numerous border regions during the reign of Tudhaliya. It was during this period that things began to fall apart rapidly for the Hittite Empire. The overall picture was one of confusion, with wars piling up one on top of the other, and a society increasingly on the verge of disintegration. Famine and disasters exacerbated the situation, creating the perfect conditions for external invasions. The Hittite Empire in the highlands was particularly susceptible to drought. Its proximity to enemies left it vulnerable to attacks from all directions. Around 1180 BC, the Hittite capital of Hattusa was razed to the ground. And soon after, each of the empire's cities suffered a similar fate. The Hittite kingdom disappeared from the annals of history. The specific reasons for its fall are complex and multifaceted. But one critical factor was external invasion. All the cities of the Hittite Empire were the targets of attacks by the Sea Peoples. However, these attacks were only one of many causes that contributed to the collapse of this civilization. Some researchers suggest that the Hittite Empire may have been attacked after the destruction of Ugarit. Hittite records mention raids and disturbances in their empire, but exact dates and details are difficult to determine. Across the eastern Mediterranean, over a span of more than 600 miles, we find this layer of destruction. The archaeological evidence is quite clear. Sometime between 1200 and 1100 BC, right at the end of the Late Bronze Age period, a wave of destruction swept over the entire region. It wiped out entire civilizations and left nothing in its wake. One by one, vast ancient empires like the Hittites, Ugarit, the Minoans, and the Mycenaean Greeks collapsed, all at the same time. They collapsed and disappeared from the historical record. Some of these areas took almost 1,000 years to recover after the violent end of the Bronze Age. And exactly what happened remains one of humanity's most debated mysteries. Further west, beyond the Hittite vassals in Anatolia, lay the lands of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. This region was Mycenaean Greece, characterized by a palatial culture of chariot-riding warrior lords backed by literate scribes and loyal followers. In the second millennium BC, the city-state of Mycenae stood as a major center of Greek civilization, a powerful city that rivaled even the Hittite capital of Hattusa. Located approximately 56 miles, about 90 kilometers southwest of Athens, Mycenae was a military fortress dominating much of southern Greece, with a population exceeding 30,000 at its peak. Like Hattusa, Mycenae adorned the gates of its imposing citadel with lions carved in stone. The hilltop citadels dominated the plains below. It was a world of grandiose masonry, fierce battles, and expansive maritime trade. A world that has been gradually unveiled over the last 2 centuries through archaeological finds and literary analysis of epic poetry. Between 1350 and 1200 BC, Mycenae entered its greatest period of prosperity. It is from this period that the greatest number of archaeological remains are preserved, including the Cyclopean walls and the royal palace. Around 1230 BC, signs of growing unrest began to appear in the Mycenaean palaces. Extensions of walls and additional constructions within the citadels suggest preparations to face external threats. Suddenly, both the Hittite and Mycenaean cities disappeared from the map. Around 1200, archaeological evidence indicates that the palace was destroyed, spelling the end of Mycenaean hegemony. Within the Mycenaean world, the archaeological record strongly supports the destruction of major structures. Its palaces were razed to the ground, and their cities were left in ruins. These buildings were consumed by fire, but the precise motives behind these fires remain shrouded in uncertainty. The identity of the parties responsible for these acts of destruction eludes us. But we cannot deny that these palaces met their end, as the Bronze Age came to an end. The devastation that swept through this region was so complete that it abruptly silenced the written word. In Greece, the historical record simply disappears, with events later remembered in part through Vardic poetry such as the Iliad, transcribed much later. This marked a period of no verifiable contact with the outside world for centuries. It is not clear whether it was civil war or external invasion that led to the decline of the Mycenaean world. The precise attribution of Mycenae's fall to the Sea Peoples remains an enigma. But the timing of this destruction aligns with the broader collapse of the Late Bronze Age. One of the ways in which the memory of the Late Bronze Age collapse may have endured to the present day is through the epic poetry of that era. And one of the epics recounts the fall of a formidable walled city in the eastern Mediterranean, Troy. The pivotal role of Mycenae in the Trojan War is what cemented its place in the collective imagination of the Greeks. For a long time, it was conjectured that the Trojan War was a figment of the imagination, and that the city of Troy was a mere myth. However, this paradigm shifted with the discovery of the remains of Troy in present-day Turkey in the late 19th century. Troy may have been a coastal outpost of the Hittite Empire. Archaeological finds confirm that Troy did indeed have a stature consistent with Homer's descriptions and boasted an impressively fortified citadel. However, the remains of Troy are strangely silent. No inscriptions or writings have been found in excavations. As a result, many scholars now believe the possibility that Homer's narrative of the Trojan War may have been based on actual events. Archaeological finds paint a vivid picture of Troy enduring repeated assaults. Scorched stones and human remains found in the houses and streets attest to these tumultuous times. Most contemporary scholars place the events of the fall of Troy at the end of the 12th century BC, during the Late Bronze Age collapse. The city of Troy, possibly recorded as Wilusa in Hittite diplomatic records, had a history of tensions with the Greeks, and may have been linked to the invasions of the Sea Peoples. At present, there is no consensus among historians and archaeologists as to what happened in Troy over the centuries. However, the city of Homer's Iliad existed and was the subject of stories that have survived to the present day, shaping patterns in Western accounts. Archaeological evidence reveals that the eastern Mediterranean region suffered widespread violence and disorder, affecting the entire coastline of what was once a peaceful sea. The pattern was consistent. Coastal societies, once thriving and prosperous, retreated inland to remote areas in the hills. Experiencing a decline in population, the failure of crops, and the abandonment of cities, some of which were never rebuilt. We have analyzed what happened in each of the great Late Bronze Age civilizations. And in both the accounts and the evidence, the enigmatic Sea Peoples emerge as one of the main factors that caused their collapse. They appear to be hordes of plunderers, ravaging entire cities in a relentless wave of conquest, leaving in their wake a trail of disruption and destruction. But who really were these enigmatic Sea Peoples? In some ancient sources, the Sea Peoples are beginning to sound like something out of a Hollywood blockbuster, an unstoppable invasion force that arrives suddenly and takes nations by surprise, wiping them out one after another. It is clear that wherever their names appear, a trail of death and destruction follows. The Bronze Age world was not prepared to defend itself against attacks from the sea, for its battles were usually organized and led by individual kings in chariots held in pre-designated places, unlike these plunderers who appeared suddenly. For a long time, historians attributed the simultaneous collapse of numerous complex societies to these invaders. Popular perception likens them to a mixture of the Vikings who ravaged medieval Europe and Attila and the Huns, portraying them as an uncontrolled force bent on annihilation. Who were these enigmatic individuals depicted in the carved inscriptions? Were they battle-hardened veterans? Opportunistic mercenaries? Unfortunately, some of these questions remain forever unanswered. The Sea Peoples in this narrative remain silent, leaving no written records and very few physical traces to offer clues to their origins. However, unusually for their time, we have a fairly clear picture of what the Sea Peoples looked like. And this image was portrayed on the outer wall of the large temple at Medinet Habu, in an extensive relief. A site where the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III chose to depict several prisoners captured during Egypt's conflict with the Sea Peoples, with intricate details. They did not have a uniform appearance, and this, along with contemporary Egyptian sources, suggests that they were not a unified army, but rather an alliance of distinct peoples sailing under the same flag. By closely examining the depiction of the Battle of the Nile on the reliefs of Medinet Habu in Egypt, it becomes clear that those who arrived on the shores of the Nile were not only soldiers, but also women and children. There has been a debate for decades as to whether the Sea Peoples were directly responsible for the collapse, or rather a symptom of it, possibly as much a victim as those they attacked. Consequently, this seems to go beyond a major battle, in which the Sea Peoples attacked the various civilizations of the time. It would represent a genuine migration into the region. Although we may never know with absolute certainty what motivated the Sea Peoples, or understand, for the most part, their daily lives and the conflicts in which they participated, the historical record remains exceptionally sparse. However, contemporary advances in archaeological, genetic, climatological, and historical research allow us to piece together a rough picture of their possible identity. The Medinet Habu relief provides archaeologists with valuable clues to the identity of the Sea Peoples. Diverse groups of people, each with distinctive attire. No leaders or kings are mentioned among the Sea Peoples. They evidently represented a mixture of different ethnicities from various regions around the Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptian sculptures allow archaeologists to distinguish at least 9 groups. In Medinet Habu, we find the names of these maritime invaders. 5 of these groups can plausibly be linked to Anatolia. These are the Teresh, the Luka, the Jaker, the Weshesh, and the Peliset. And the Teresh have been linked to the Taruisa, a Hittite name possibly referring to Troy. The Peliset are mentioned in the Old Testament as the Philistines. The 6th group is the Ekwesh, who were almost certainly Achaean Greeks and colonized the western coast of Anatolia as well as the Aegean Islands. The 7th group was the Danyan, who probably came originally from northern Syria. The 8th group was the Shekelesh, who were related to the Sickles of Sicily. And the last group identified was the Shurden, who probably lived in Cyprus at that time, but later became Sardinians, settling on the island. For centuries, it was widely believed that the Phoenicians were the first seafaring culture to sail across the Mediterranean and left their mark by establishing trading posts during their far-ranging voyages that began around the 10th century BC. However, recent research suggests that these boat-building innovations may have emerged earlier, possibly toward the end of the Bronze Age. But why would such a vast force of diverse people leave their homelands and venture out to sea with no apparent direction, no leaders, and no command structure? To answer this question, we must investigate what other factors might have prompted these large groups of people to migrate in search of new lands. The great powers of the Bronze Age in Anatolia, mainland Greece, and in the northern Levant met their end. By this point, this was the most catastrophic social disintegration in history, the first substantial disruption since ancient Sumer's first city builders, some 3 millennia ago. But what if the Sea Peoples were not the antagonists in this story? And what if they were not responsible for the collapse of these civilizations, and rather a group of victims? It is hard to imagine how a disparate band of maritime plunderers without centralized command could have brought about the demise of an entire era. In recent years, the idea of systemic collapse has come to the forefront as a major factor in these events. Some scholars propose a radical explanation for the collapse of the late Bronze Age, challenging the prevailing view that earthquakes or invasions are insufficient explanations for a total societal collapse. They point to environmental factors, in particular, a severe regional drought followed by famine. A famine extensive enough to destabilize late Bronze Age civilizations. At that time, the superpowers of that era were not isolated kingdoms. They were interconnected and closely linked. If one of these great powers stumbled, it set off a chain reaction, that could lead to the collapse of the others. By obtaining sediment core samples from the seafloor in the eastern Mediterranean, paleoclimatologists identified a marked decrease in sea temperature that would have significantly affected expected rainfall patterns, ultimately leading to drought, crop failures, and widespread famine. Areas that were once fertile became desert. This scientific evidence aligns with the written records of the time, including Hittite reports of severe hardship in their mountainous region. The situation was desperate, as reflected in the letters from Ugarit that describe sending large quantities of grain to powerful city-states and the crisis's duration. Earthquakes also played a key role in these events. Seismological data reveal that the 12th century BC experienced an increase in seismic activity in Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. Interestingly, Egypt remained relatively unscathed by these earthquakes, allowing its imperial administration to remain intact. In the midst of this chaos, it's plausible that the citizens of some ancient empires, driven by famine, drought, and disease, rose up in rebellion and set fire to their own cities. Society was crumbling due to famines and prolonged droughts. And wherever these groups went, more desperate souls joined their ranks. It is believed that these dispossessed people abandoned their declining civilizations, eventually forming the multi-ethnic group known as the Sea Peoples. They became a rootless and stateless community. For these Aegean coastal communities, navigation was an integral part of daily life, and they had young men trained in military tactics, ready to take command of ships and secure their food supply. In the Bronze Age, people knew the coasts of the Levant and probably tried to reach those areas. Their numbers increased until they became an overwhelming force, a roaming seaborne army. They had no land to call home, but they continued to search the seas for it. This depiction of the Sea Peoples is perhaps the most compelling. It unravels the mystery surrounding their origin, showing how this diverse group suddenly emerged from the sea, with no apparent direction, no leadership, and no command structure. This was not an abrupt invasion, but a gradual migration that occurred over several decades. A broader look at the entire Mediterranean during this period reveals a sequence of events that began with the Dorian invasion in the Balkans, and followed by invasions moving from the Balkans into Asia Minor, then towards Cyprus, and finally along the coast of present-day Lebanon. A domino effect that began in the Aegean and spread throughout the eastern Mediterranean, with the Sea Peoples attacking coastal regions in search of new places to settle. But there is another important factor that contributed to the collapse of the great civilizations of the time. By the 12th century BC, a new metal had begun to appear, signaling the beginning of a new era. It was iron, a metal that was abundant and available to the small kingdoms of the time. The Sea Peoples and other land-based tribes came to be equipped with iron weapons. On the one hand, out of desperation due to famine in the rural areas, they would have risen up, armed, and set out to destroy their own cities. On the other hand, small states, neighbors of the great empires of the time, were in a position to invade them. So, this historical period witnessed large and complex states defending themselves, not only from invasions by less sophisticated neighboring states, but also from the attacks of the Sea Peoples that struck them just when these civilizations were at their weakest. In the late Bronze Age, all the nations of the Eastern Mediterranean were affected. However, these can be divided into two categories. First, are those that succumbed to the pressures of the time, disappeared without a trace, leaving only ruins. Among these were Mycenae, the Hittites, Ugarit, and other civilizations. Second are those that managed to survive, albeit weakened. The two great empires that overcame this collapse were Egypt and Assyria. In particular, Assyria, which ruled the northern region of present-day Iraq, survived by a strategy of withdrawing from less defensible territories and consolidating around its imperial heartland, near the city of Nineveh, between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Egypt's situation is more intriguing. It also belongs to the second category of survivors, and much of the credit goes to the pharaoh, Ramses III. Ramses was a determined and persistent ruler. During much of his reign, Egypt thrived and grew wealthy. But at the end of his reign, Egypt would suffer one of the deepest declines in its history, marking the empire's fall. However, the actions of Ramses III ensured that Egypt's cities did not suffer the same fate as Mycenae and Ugarit, which now lay in ruins and ashes. Ramses was determined to prevent Egypt from suffering the same fate. Egypt could not employ the same strategy as the Assyrians, who were retreating and fortifying their defenses. With an extensive Mediterranean coastline, Egypt was vulnerable to invasion from the sea, and maritime trade was the backbone of its economy. Ramses knew he needed a plan, but it would not be simple. The Egyptians had little reputation as navigators. They were primarily a land power. To counter Egypt's strategy, the Sea Peoples recognized that they needed to attack their vulnerable point, the Nile River itself. All of Egypt's major cities were located along the Nile, and if the Nile became the battlefield, the Egyptian cities would fall one by one, along with their wealth. So, one fateful day, around 1177 BC, sightings of black sails on the Egyptian horizon marked a turning point. A fleet of warships silently slipped into the fertile delta at the mouth of the Nile. Ramses realized that he must take advantage of Egypt's remaining strongholds. He opted to set up an ambush, hoping to surprise the Sea Peoples. As the enemy ships gathered in the waters outside the delta, Ramses gathered a large Egyptian army. Archers lined the banks, backed by thousands of spearmen, all concealed, ready to attack. As the enemy ships approached and came into range, Ramses unleashed hell. Ramses' archers fired a continuous rain of arrows at the enemy ships. Panic-stricken, the Sea Peoples tried to land on the shores, but the Egyptian spearmen advanced from the reed beds to meet them. While the enemy was being held back on the shore, the small Egyptian navy sailed and attacked them. It was frantic hand-to-hand combat. The boats capsized, throwing men into the river, where bodies floated. Finally, the Sea Peoples were overwhelmed. Ramses' plan had worked, and the Egyptians were the first to repel these maritime invaders and stop their campaign of destruction. The last desperate attempt by the Sea Peoples to seize the lands of Egypt had failed. However, some of the Sea Peoples managed to escape total destruction and settled in the marshes of the Nile. One of these groups found their home in what is now Gaza, in southern Palestine. They settled as the Peliset, later known as the Philistines. They would go on to become a great rival to the Kingdom of Israel, and ultimately would give its name to the modern region of Palestine. Despite the Egyptian victory, it was not enough to save Egypt. It was left isolated in a devastated region. Every land around it had been plundered and reduced to ashes. Trade routes were now broken, and Egypt's economy experienced a rapid and steady decline. By the end of the Late Bronze Age was only a shadow of what it once was. It was never able to fully regain its imperial power. Ramses III ruled for 31 years, but his death was followed by years of discord among his heirs. Eventually, the Egyptian Empire fractured and was lost forever, less than 80 years after the reign of Ramses III. In the Late Bronze Age, the known world was an intricate network of interlocking societies. These societies were so dependent on each other that none could afford another's collapse. This interdependence proved to be a source of strength, but it also revealed their most significant vulnerability. As the climate changed, populations sought refuge, and invaders landed on their shores. This complex web of interdependence began to crumble. Beginning in the 12th century BC and continuing for at least a century, the cities that once thrived in the Eastern Mediterranean ceased to exist. Thanks to recent advances in scientific research, a new perspective on history has finally opened up. What acted as the spark for these interconnected events during the 13th and 12th centuries BC was a colossal and far-reaching catastrophe. It was not just the Sea Peoples, or famine, or only earthquakes, or a volcanic eruption. It was the culmination of these events. The bold assaults of the Sea Peoples targeted the Egyptian Empire, the ancient Greeks, the prosperous city of Ugarit, and many other coastal cities of the Mediterranean. Although their true identity may forever remain unknown, these enigmatic people left an enduring mark on the Late Bronze Age. And the collapse of this era would not have taken place without the involvement of the Sea Peoples.
Thanks everyone for making it this far. It really helps us spread the word when you leave a comment and share this video on social media. And as always, your support through Super Thanks or joining as a member of the channel from $1 a month in our Pillar tier helps us keep investing to bring you higher quality documentaries. Thank you very much.